Alrighty, welcome everyone to another ACFCS Financial Crimecast special video version here, where we talk to top thought leaders about key financial crime trends and compliance. And today we have a very special guest, Joshua Fruth. Joshua has more than a decade of deep experience in the public and private sectors investigating terror groups in this area, nascent field called hybrid threat finance. Now, there's three things I wanted to talk to you about today, Josh. One of them is a special event that we're working on together, but really you guys have done an incredible amount of legwork to kind of look at the transactional DNA of terror groups, of different threat actors, and actually boil that down into typologies, things that compliance professionals can see across their transaction systems to better respond. The other piece of that, the FinCEN files, a huge
Right.
leak, highly awaited and anticipated, where SARS, law enforcement sensitive SARS, have been leaked. So now there's a lot of pressure on banks on how they dealt with, again, top risky groups, how they responded, and details in these SARS are putting a lot of pressure on the anti-money laundering field. Not a lot of it positive, unfortunately. And as well, we want to look at a response to this. Right before this happened, a week before this isn't happening in a vacuum. And again, we don't know if FinCEN kind of planned it this way, but the US Treasury's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network came out with huge potential overhaul of the nation's anti-money laundering defenses. Again, focusing more on effectiveness and outputs versus auditable inputs, kind of what regulators want. So again, bridging that divide between what you do for regulators, but what you want to do in terms of meeting the needs of law enforcement. But please, thank you so much for being here, and tell everyone a little bit about yourself.
Hey, Brian, you and I have known each other for a long time, so it's always
A couple
good to
years now.
yeah, long and short of it, I was a law enforcement officer in the state of Ohio, worked a wide range of problem sets from gangs to drug trafficking to sex trafficking to small arms weapons proliferation. Had a dual career in the U.S. Army as an intelligence officer. So in that capacity, got to learn a lot about groups of bad guys as well. Spent a few years in various financial institutions as a consultant, as a contractor, and in various roles within the risk and compliance space. So from tactical to operational to strategic, from AML fraud, sanctions watch list filtering, investigations to KYC, EDD type investigations, to developing the transaction monitoring infrastructure, the risks, the detection models, or rules or detection scenarios, how to optimize them, how to implement different systems and technologies, and how to run, the risk and policy and procedure aspect of it. Had a chance to work in other positions within the public sector as well, advance international security interests.
That's fantastic. So, so just so everyone listening here understands this Josh isn't just theory crafting here. These are things he has done in investigations as a police officer, in investigations with the government, actually detailing and following the money trail for different terror groups, narco groups. So this is stuff that he has done, actually all pieces of the puzzle. Now, we know the different stakeholders in this game. You have the anti-money laundering professionals kind of at the front line, trying to create this intelligence for law enforcement. You have regulators looking at those AML programs, checking the boxes, making sure they follow their AML obligations. You have the investigators building cases off of this information. And obviously, we have someone here who knows that intimately, as he's done all of these pieces. So Josh, tell me about, there's something that one thing that has always struck me about you is your passion for this field, to learn about this and get the most detailed, nitty-gritty knowledge to the individuals who might not have access to this, either due to their experience, due to budgets. That's the anti-money laundering analyst. And there's we just talked about this a few moments ago, but there's two pieces of this puzzle at the very least for a financial crime compliance professional to be successful, particularly at that analyst level. They need the systems, AI, you've heard these buzzwords, AI, machine learning, things like that. You need resources, obviously, but you need the expertise to look at those transactions as if they're looking through your eyes. And that's where I think you really want to try to bring a little bit of thought leadership and guidance to these professionals.
Well, I mean, there's, you kind of hit on it. There's two different components of this. There's a technology component to it, right? Like how, we've got, a bank that has millions of customers, right? So We can't review all of them manually. So there has to be some, this is for those that don't have a transaction monitoring background, the general gist is how do we screen through all these people and determine the ones that we actually ought to look at, if that makes sense. And the reality is, I've sat, as you have, Brian, with some of the top AI, robotic process automation, machine learning folks in the world that swear by what they do. But the reality is when you deal with machine learning or artificial intelligence, it's only as good as the data that goes in, so as the old saying goes, junk in, junk out. And my question for these folks is always, when they come in and they say, okay, we're going to fix the technology side so we actually detect money laundering and terrorist financing. I always say, so what underlying data sets, what attributes or criteria are you using that are specifically going to detect the threat actors, right? Because the way that we've detected money laundering for so many years has been very action centric. So you do a thing, you structure, you deposit excessive cash, the bank money comes into the bank and goes out really quickly, but it's so broad brush in nature that it's just not detailed enough to really capitalize on who's actually laundering money. And those that are actually laundering money are not individuals operating on their own accord. So it might be an individual account, it might be a business account within your bank, but if they are laundering money, chances are they're operating on behalf of some sort of threat organization, be it a state or non-state actor in some capacity, and those groups are tied up in networks. We'll talk about that later. But the general gist of it is, we anticipate that money laundering is going to be, occurring within the construct of these organizations, and there isn't enough sophisticated knowledge input into the data sets that serve as the baseline for these artificial intelligence scenarios for them to actually work. So what it ends up being is a case of basically how to tune alerts to increase efficiency, but there's no improvement on the actual detection of illicit finance typologies. So that's the first component. That's the technology component. The second component is the analyst or the end user. And kind of circling back to my previous comment about, action-centric versus actor-centric. The thing that we're teaching in the AML community right now is all of the actions. Okay, so like, how do you look at a customer? How do you gauge them? What's the KYC profile look like? Okay, they have this job, they make this much money a year. This is their source of funds. This is their use of funds. Like, what are the things that we look for? The typologies indicative of potentially suspicious activity. The structuring is the one that always comes to people's mind, but there's 100 different ones. It could be more dependent on the product types. But what we're not teaching the analysts or the investigators is, what does the actor look like? What does the threat actor look like? And in this series coming up, as you discussed, we're really going to parse through that global threat landscape and identify who's actually laundering money, because it is relatively static. The global threat landscape is what it is. We really want to parse out the threat classifications. So for example, drug trafficking is a threat classification in itself. Terrorism financing is a threat classification. Human trafficking, small arms weapons proliferation, these things are threat classifications. So if you take this construct, you have the global threat landscape, you have threat classifications, drugs, and by the way, these are state and non-state actors. So you could have corrupt or sanctioned regimes and how they move money, or misappropriate funds from their governments. And you have these various non-state actor organizations as well. So within that threat classification, there are subclassifications. So perfect example, let's take drug trafficking. What would subclassifications look like in drug trafficking? Well, it's going to be basically based on what type of drug it is. Because if you think about it, heroin has its own specific nexus of where it's at in the world. It's either in the Helmand province in Afghanistan, or it's in Northwest Mexico, or a couple other places, China, Myanmar, Thailand to some lesser extent. But generally speaking, it's very fixed where heroin, the opium, or the poppy plant grows in the world, and where opium can be extracted to make morphine and heroin. Likewise, cocaine, it's very specific places in Colombia and a couple other countries in South America where that coca plant grows. And you can do the same thing with marijuana. You can even really get into some of the synthetic narcotics like crystal meth, where there's very specific places, both state and non-state hostile actors that are producing and distributing this poison. So that would be an example of how we take a threat classification and parse out the other subclassifications. I'll give you a second example. We talk human trafficking, right? So people use, I've sat through so many human trafficking briefs that there's been no substance. There's just statistics. Human trafficking is bad. Okay, thank you. I knew that. Human trafficking is bad. Here's the statistics to show how big of an issue it is. Okay, thank you. I've heard that also. Tell me something I can.
Tell me something I don't know. That's what Josh wants.
What can I use? What can somebody take back and do something about it? So when we take a threat classification like human trafficking, your massage parlor where you're seeing immigrant young Asian women that are in these environments where they're either in a massage parlor or a nail salon, and they're trafficked for labor and sexual exploitation. This is a distinctly unique threat subclassification than your street level prostitute in the inner city that has a pimp or is managed by a criminal gang. Okay, it's distinctly different than your Russia, former Soviet bloc type high-end prostitutes, where they're in they look like they're free, right? They don't look the same as like your street corner prostitutes. They look like they're free, but the mechanism of control over these women is threats to their family back in their home country, right? So every specific subtypology within a threat classification or subclassification within a threat classification, like within human trafficking or within drug trafficking, correlates with different threat organizations. Likewise, each threat organization has their own unique DNA in terms of how they operate as a business. So I always tell people, when we look at, and I'm going to kind of explain this, what I'm going through today is basically hybrid threat finance. That's what we're going to talk about. So if you haven't heard the term before, hybrid threat finance is a combination of hybrid threat doctrine and threat finance. You might have heard counter threat finance. Counter threat finance means that we are countering or interdicting or disrupting threat finance. So the notion of what hybrid threat finance is a combination of the hybrid threat, and you're going to hear different agencies and different governments are going to define this different ways. But the way I look at it, Brian, is the hybrid threat is basically the intersection, the relationship intersection between different threat organizations. And those threat organizations could be state or non-state actors. So number one, intersection of threat organizations. The second part of the hybrid threat is that the intersection of those organizations, they are in different threat classifications. Does that make sense? So different organizations, different threat classifications. In some cases, you could actually have a hybrid threat that is one single organization. So for example, like the terrorist group Hezbollah, it is a Shiite proxy violent insurgent group or terrorist group of Iran. However, it's also a political party in Lebanon. They're also a military in Lebanon. They're also a terrorist group. They're also a drug trafficking organization. They're also a human trafficking organization. So you have this convoluted
they're ticking all the boxes.
of threat classifications that exist within the construct of this one organization, if that makes sense. So kind of getting back to, so the second component of this is the threat finance element, right? So this is the notion that you're taking an organization like a pyramid type structure, okay? Think of a multinational corporation. When we look at a pyramid structure, just any major global organization, okay? There's going to be your horizontal, your vertical operational echelons, right? You got the CEO at the top and the worker bees at the bottom, right? But you also have your horizontal lines of business, right? You have, business intelligence and operations and communications and sales and marketing, et cetera. You have all these different lines of business. When we deal with threat organizations, they operate in the same manner. They have this vertical and horizontal component to it. And the mechanisms of revenue generation are incredibly important to these groups. They're like anybody else, like you or I. If we don't make money, we can't pay our bills. We don't have a roof over our head. We can't eat. Businesses are the same way. They go underwater. They go out of business. They declare bankruptcy. They need to make money, right? And threat organizations are the exact same way. And I don't care who they are. I don't care if it's a terrorist group and they proclaim to be ideological. They are all profit focused, all of them. So for these organizations to continue to exist and to operationalize themselves, there's three things that they really need They need to be able to, they need to have a revenue generation event. They need to be able to make money. They need to be able to make their money usable. And that's the money laundering process. It's the old adage.
Move the money, right.
Right. If I gave you a briefcase of cash, it isn't worth the money it's printed on if you can't explain to the tax man where it came from. Right. So it's creating that backstory and segmenting or anonymizing those funds from their illicit source. And then you have the thing that people always forget is the expenditures, right? These are businesses. They have cost. They have to pay for salaries for their people. A terrorist group has to pay for martyrdom funds for the families of deceased fighters.
Wow.
They pay for weapons, equipment, ammunition, vehicles, lodging, transportation. There's so much cost that they have. So you got to think about basically, if you define money laundering as 3 phases, placement, layer, and integration, I think that's wrong. I think you really need to define money laundering in 5 phases. There's a revenue generation event that is that illicit funding source. Then there's the placement, layer, and integration. And then there's that expenditures. And when you take this together, all the human rights violations that these groups are causing, now you're basically able to say, this is how they operationalize their sustainment capability, their ability to sustain their operations. That's why the money's so important. So one of the things I say, Brian, when we teach this is that money laundering is the #1 human rights issue of our time. And I'll say that again. Money laundering is the #1 human rights issue of our time.
Now I'm curious because a lot of people would fight you on that and say, no, it's corruption. It's, literally just not having rights for certain groups, keeping them down. But I'm curious, tell me a little bit about why you think that.
Well, again, just circling back, for any of these groups to exist, it's not just that they have this revenue generation event, it's that they're able to access the funds. And in this modern world, you have to be able to explain, we talk tax evasion and these Paradise Papers and some of these different leaks, some of these different scandals where everybody's like, man, the tax evasion component to it's so big, right? I mean, it's just rich people that are in offshore islands, but they're missing the big picture. It's not just rich people trying not to pay taxes. There's a specific reason that we have tax law. There's a reason that the IRS folks exist. It's not just to make sure that we're paying taxes. There's also this thing called conspiracy law. So if you, for example, are showing that you have, millions of dollars that you're spending, but, your W-2 and your 1099 at the end of the year from the IRS showed you made $100,000 that year, that disproportionality, the federal government doesn't need to prove that you obtain that illicit wealth through drug trafficking. They just need to show that there was a conspiracy to commit tax evasion, wire fraud, money laundering, things of that sort, the follow-up offenses that come from that tax evasion. So as a result, when you think about money laundering, it's incumbent upon the threat actor organization to be able to not only anonymize the proceeds or segment the proceeds from the illicit source, but to create a legitimate backstory, so to speak, within that integration space that's going to explain to the taxman or taxwoman where those funds came from. So when you talk about something like you mentioned, I think, corruption or civil liberties, right? Take a place like, Venezuela, where people think we're in a police state. Go to Venezuela. I'll show you a police state. We go look at, for example, I'm trying to think of another example, like Iran, go to Saudi Arabia, and we literally have, huge civil liberties issues. Folks are, because of their religion or because of, if somebody committed adultery or because of their sexual preference, are being stoned to death or thrown off buildings, literally killed for these things. So yeah, huge human rights issues. The human trafficking epidemic, I'm with you. We're talking modern human slavery, young women, young girls, young boys raped 12 hours a day. The drug trafficking is just absolutely outrageous right now. I mean, I've seen this, as very up close and personal, like bringing people back to life with Narcan. And, when there's a batch that goes out of fentanyl, Chinese fentanyl lacing additive, laced heroin, and the amount of fentanyl they put into the batch is just slightly wrong, everybody's dead. There's no bringing it back. And that completely decimates families. It rips apart communities.
Oh,
and all these things are important. But if you think about it, it doesn't matter what the subject is. It doesn't matter if it's terrorism or drugs or human trafficking or whatever, to kind of circle back to your initial question. The ability for these threat organizations to, again, I come back to this keyword sustainment, to sustain their operations in the future, to continue to enslave women, to continue to addict our communities on heroin, to continue to pay for high-profile terrorist attacks, to continue to exploit communities and misappropriate funds from governments, and by sheer virtue of the ability to bribe and extort and buy influence and power and protection. All of those things are incumbent upon an organization's ability to launder money. If you can remove that part of it, they can't operationalize their proceeds. They can't sustain themselves with their expenditures. And if you can basically disrupt the money laundering process, it opens them up for disruption. So I would argue, regardless of the subject matter, money laundering is tied into all of them, and that's why it's the most important human rights issue of our time.
And I have to agree with you, because, what you're seeing now is because of the pandemic, and I've seen this in different news stories, that because the global money flows have been changed so drastically, and these bad guys have tried to kind of weave in with maybe larger illicit trade and things like that, but because it's slowed down so much, they can't move the money. They can't launder the money. So you're having these massive seizures of funds and drugs because they can't do exactly what you just said, operationalize that value and sustain the larger enterprise.
Absolutely. And these organizations do not want to bulk cash smuggle. They don't want to do that. And, we've seen them, for example, during COVID-19, we've seen them really get into the PPE business. They're opportunistic. These are multinational corporations. They just happen to be illicit multinational corporations. But, you have a group like the Sinaloa cartel, and they're factoring the 12 to 15% loss on margins by virtue of money laundering and what loads get seized. I mean, they've got it down to a science. So, you look at these organizations, and they have their own finance line of business within the organization, both in terms of, how to generate, how to launder, how to operationalize the proceeds, how to pay expenses. I mean, they basically have a human resources department. We really need to think about how to disrupt this going forward in the future, because I would like to actually get into the FinCEN files for a moment, if we could talk that. I know that it was something you had mentioned earlier.
Yeah, and actually, we'll get into that in just a moment. But one thing that really I was very happy to hear, Josh, is the event that you're working on. You've come up with some of the biggest names in the industry, but who you are targeting to me was very important, because you were saying, I want to get this information, everything that's in your head, everything, all the different ways of kind of pulling out the transactional DNA of these different terror and threat actors, because that's going to look different to a bank. And you want to be able to get this knowledge to the anti-money laundering analyst, because that's kind of the inflection point, is that person looking at that alert, hopefully having the expertise or being sensitized to be able to make the right decision to raise that alert, to turn it into a SAR, maybe even hopefully that they have a strong relationship with law enforcement, and they're picking up the phone and calling someone. Because to me, it seems like you're addressing a gap in the industry, because again, whether you're a mid-level analyst at a large bank, or you're a smaller financial crime compliance officer at a smaller or mid-sized bank, you might not normally have access to this depth and level,
right,
really, of expertise.
No, absolutely. We're bringing in some of the top folks in the world into this hybrid series. This is a gap. This is a gap. We've, had this AML industry for some years, and yourself and some of your peer associations do a great job. But one of the things we consistently hear from BSA officers, different financial institutions, reg tech firms, even law enforcement agencies, even military intelligence and other agencies, is that there's really nobody that's teaching the practitioner level skills. And there's no standardization in terms of, what makes a good financial crime investigator. So we want to change that. We want to bring the best experts in their specific crafts. So we're going to address in this series and beyond, we're going to address such a wide breadth and scope of topics. So if I have a topic, for example, that is based on, money laundering related to Russia and former Soviet bloc countries engaged in small arms weapons proliferation, then I'm going to bring you somebody that's worked small arms weapons proliferation in Russia and Soviet bloc countries for 30 years. That's the standard that we're going to operate on.
Wow.
So this webinar series, this is not just going to be you log into a webinar. This is a class. This is academic instruction. We are going to move through a structured curriculum. Our instructors that are subject matter experts on these topics, and then our keynote speakers that are some of the biggest financial crime warriors in the world with real world experience. They're going to then contextualize what we're going through, basically full circle with case studies. At the end of each of these webinars and the end of the series, participants are going to have the opportunity to take a practical exam in our learning management system. If they pass that exam, they're going to receive an actual certificate that shows not just their participation, but their demonstrated competency in the brief subject materials. And I think that's really, from a hands-on and practical perspective, you know, if I'm a BSA officer, if I'm a law enforcement, you know, executive, whatever, I want to know that my employees are understanding these practical skills, that they're getting hands-on and that they're demonstrating competency. So I want to know that I'm getting my return of that. So that's something that it's going to be a cornerstone of this program, is ensuring that knowledge transference to the students.
And if anyone, we're going to talk about the FinCEN files in a moment, but if anyone wants to kind of get a preview of this, Deb Geister, who works with Josh at Section 2 Financial Intelligence, she actually did a 3-part webinar series with ACFCS on hybrid threat finance. So that's actually in our archives right now, and it's absolutely fantastic. But what Josh is talking about is this on steroids. Like, it's going to be amazing, and it's going to be the top practitioners with typologies, with case studies. So it's exactly what you want to do to be able to see through the eyes of someone like Josh. Now, FinCEN files. I started hearing murmurings of this about a week ago, where some of my top compliance professionals started reaching out to me and go, Brian, there's going to be a whopper coming. I'm hearing there's going to be a big leak, and it's coming from FinCEN. And I immediately got very, very worried because, you know, when you're in this space a long time, you get to know the top agencies involved, and you see, you know, what they're doing, you see where they've struggled. And I've thought for a long time, FinCEN, in having this massive database of anti-money laundering filings, of SAR filings, of CTR filings, I thought, man, what a tempting target for a couple of different groups, a jaded insider, maybe some kind of hacking group, like Josh had said, foreign nation state actors, just grabbing that, selling these SARs to the highest bidder. Wouldn't a corrupt oligarch love to know how many SARs are on him? And a worst case scenario is some, you know, some hacking collective breaking in and poisoning all of it, and you know, ransomware attacks so that all the SARs are gone now. Obviously that didn't happen. Those were some of my fears. But FinCEN files is a pretty big deal. Now, we're not going to overblow this. You know, we have to take a neutral perspective here. So Josh, what's kind of your take on this? Because you can argue both sides. You can say, look at all these SARs, look at how these banks were dealing with these very risky people, corrupt people, things indicative of money laundering, shell companies, things like that. But they filed these SARs. They did what they were supposed to do. And, you know, banks aren't supposed to see a SAR, do an investigation, immediately drop the account. They're not the investigators. They create the SAR, they send it to FinCEN, and maybe they work with law enforcement on a deeper investigation. What's your kind of take on what has come out, what it really means, and kind of what are some things that are going to happen after this going forward for all the stakeholders, banks, regulators, and investigators?
Yeah, I've had to sit back and let this marinate. I haven't. You're the first interviewer that I've actually talked to about this subject, because I wanted to sit back and.
Good. No pressure. But Josh, can you just solve AML for me? Thanks a lot.
There's a few things that are in my mind. So first off, the suspicion based on the news that's out there, and you heard this a year or a week ago. I heard about this in 2018. This was when Natalie Mayflower Sowers Edwards was a FinCEN employee. She was a senior policy advisor that was fired and was arrested in tandem with the leak. Basically, as the story goes, within the news cycle, she leaked to, I think, Miami Herald and BuzzFeed.
BuzzFeed, right.
And then that information, you know, made its way to ICIJ, who put a whole bunch of people together. So and by the way, she pled guilty and she got a ridiculous plea deal. So just first and foremost, just for anybody that was excited to get a chance to see that data, you shouldn't be, because this is not a good thing. This is a tragedy. This is a tragedy. we think of like, Manning and Snowden, these huge leakers. Now, obviously, they were leaking classified data that could cause exceptionally grave harm to U.S. national security. This is the reason that this data is sensitive or classified, is to protect Americans, to protect method sources, and to protect us from our enemies, as a country. I mean, so it's very, very important. And while this was not classified data that she released, it was BSA sensitive, law enforcement sensitive data. So as far as I'm concerned, she should have been tried with treason and sedition. I mean, and should have been old school. I mean, this is like unbelievable what she did, the amount of harm that she did to our national security. Like, it's something that I, as an intelligence professional, take extremely offensively, and would, it makes me angry to even think about it. But the gist of it is this. She was ideologically motivated, or so it seems. She released about a little over 2,000 SARs that took place over the course of years. And of that leak, that was about 0.002% of like 1% of the SARs that were actually submitted or filed by financial institutions in the U.S. during that time. So again, before anybody jumps to conclusions about the things that they think they know based on this sample, you're looking at a data sampling that is very, very small in nature.
It's a small slice, right?
By a person that was ideologically motivated in the release. So you're seeing very specific things. The second, political nature again. And the second thing, is that the things that were outlined in this, that culminated in an aggregate $2 trillion in suspicious transactions, or transactions that were filed as suspicious. I'm sure you've had the same response from people, Brian, talking to folks in industry, like even BSA officers. It's like monopoly money. They can't even conceptualize that $2 trillion in prospective suspicious transactions funneled through the U.S. financial system. We got to remember, this is not just a global thing. By sheer virtue of these SARs being filed with FinCEN, these are institutions that are regulated by FinCEN. So these are $2 trillion in suspicious or potentially suspicious transactions that funneled through the U.S. market, and we're only talking about 0.002% of the SARs from that time period. So I don't think that even the compliance officers really conceptualized how big this thing is. The other thing to come out of this, and I've been saying this for years, Deb's been saying this for years, but I don't think people realize that when we talk about money laundering, like 99.9% of global money laundering is not individuals operating on their own accord. It is threat organizations. We talked about the hybrid.
Absolutely. Large networks, right.
We talked about the hybrid threat concept, but it's the idea of this relationship between organizations that extends to illicit finance. And that's really what hybrid threat finance is. You have hybrid threat networks of state and non-state actors across different threat classifications that are intertwined with one another. And then we're specifically within that pyramid construct and those different lines of businesses, focusing on the illicit finance component and how that relates to their relationships. So to that point, I think the FinCEN files, if there's anything that's positive that's come out of this, I think people are starting to see, oh, wow, like we really are dealing explicitly with threat organizations, and they are still penetrating our financial system. And whatever we were doing before, it has not been sufficient at disrupting this threat, be it on the technology side, the risk side, the investigation side. It was insufficient.
So actually, I think you make a really good point, and that's, I'm trying to see the different perspectives here, the positives and the negatives, and that's what I said in the story that I wrote. I said, yeah, while this might be a great day for investigative journalism, it's a very dark day for the financial crime compliance field and for law enforcement, because it's painting, compliance professionals as not doing a good job. It's painting, law enforcement as a group that's trying to do great work, but, is still allowing these banks to apparently, serve these large threat actor groups. But I think what people are missing in all of this is that, these are groups of very dedicated, very passionate individuals in these institutions that are absolutely doing the best that they can with the, the kind of, parameters that they have to live and work in. such as, a limited amount of budget, limited staff, limited resources, limited access to technology, and they're trying to improve all the time. And last bit of contextual point here, if you look at any, and this is, I also mentioned this in my story, any of these banks that they, the Deutsches, all these are operations that have paid massive penalties, but they've also tried to become much better allies of law enforcement in terms of improving their AML program.
So just a couple quick comments. Number one, you're right. The negative press that's coming through doesn't give enough credit to the banks in with respect.
Exactly. Yes.
Filed the SARS, so you're vilifying them just because their customer was this bad guy or this bad organization, but they filed the SARS. Number one. Number two, as you know, and maybe the public outside the compliance world doesn't know, a lot of times these compliance officers will get these no account closure, requirements from law enforcement. So they'll say, hey, this bad guy's got this account, we want to continue to monitor it, so do not close the account. So they continue to bank this customer, but they've been required to do so by law enforcement. So I think that's another consideration. The other thing is, we know historically that the level of inefficiency within the transaction monitoring programs that something like on average, industry average, I think there's like 90 to 96% of transaction monitoring system
alerts
are dispositioned in the first layer of review as closed without issue. So they're not escalated. Those that are escalated to a case and become a SAR end up being around 2 or 3% of everything that has alerted. So at that level of inefficiency, I would say that, conversely, you're asking, the banks are not, clearly they're not identifying the networks collectively that well. So what's being missed? If we're seeing kind of the sexy news stories, so to speak, in terms of some of the things that have been escalated, we're not really contextualizing everything that's been missed. But I agree that the effort and the desire is there. Certainly there's some negative news stories, at least pertaining to some of these financial institutions, the leadership outside of their compliance. I think a lot of compliance officers doing the right thing, but this should be a lesson as well that, your moral code, your integrity as a compliance officer has to be just cement. There is no gray area. If it's right, it's right. If it's wrong, it's wrong. And if that means you have to go find a job at another institution, it's better than getting blackballed from the industry or being personally liable. So, compliance officers, if they're seeing all these things, they need to know that they have to have guts and they have to have integrity and do the right thing. And I'll pause there.
No, you actually piqued my interest as well. One of the biggest gaps, and you kind of hit upon this, is banks kind of seeing all the different pieces of this threat organization, this threat corporation, if you will, but from their perspective, because they're doing it on purpose. The bad guys are doing it on purpose, where they're spreading different pieces of their operation all over the world to different banks, to different kinds of financial institutions. This one at a Hawaladar, this one at an MSB. This is the only way they're going to touch this bank in this area, in this region, from this correspondent that has a very poor AML regime. So, public-private partnerships, that's something that we've talked a lot about. But it may be, again, I'm trying to find the positive here for the compliance space. Is there an opportunity for compliance professionals to learn while looking through these and kind of seeing, okay, this guy touched my bank in this way, but I just noticed that he touched this bank over here in this way, and he touched that bank in this way. So now you're kind of getting to see the different pieces of the puzzle.
So yes and no. Yes and no. Yes, it's good as a case study. It's good. It's already out there. People ought to learn from what they did see and understand and conceptualize it. But here, when I said that this was a massive national security issue, and that this purported woman that leaked this should be tried with treason, I meant it. And the reason I meant it is, if you think about the organizations, both state and non-state organizations, be it a North Korea or an Iran or Venezuela or whatever. In the case, we saw like Oleg Deripaska, the Russian oligarch tied to Putin, who I can't stand. That he's like a James Bond villain. But you look at all these bad guys and all these networks out here. If you are one of those organizations, one of those threat organizations that has been named in within the FinCEN papers, and those underlying SARs have identified not only what you did, like your typologies, the way that you laundered money, but also the way financial institutions detected and investigated the red flags that set them off. What are you now going to do? You are going to change your tactics, techniques, and procedures. You're going to change the way that you launder money as a result of this.
You're going to change it up. Yep.
You know, we look at one of the previous scandals with the Russian mirror trading where they moved $10 billion that way. Like, all it takes is one mechanism that works, and the amount of damage that can be done, the amount of money that can be laundered can cause so massive of human rights issues around the world. We can't afford this. That's why these things have to be sensitive. That's why these sources and methods, not just within the government space, but also within the banking space in terms of that detection targeting philosophy, have to be sensitive. Because these groups, if they find out that we know what they're doing and what we're looking at to try to detect them, they modify their money laundering practices. And it can take a long time to then figure out what typologies they have modified their approach to.
Now, I asked you this question, and you gave me an interesting response, because I was wondering, because now we talked to neutral, we talked to potential positive, and obviously there's a lot of negative effects to this for the stakeholders in this industry. But okay, so now banks, they're trying to do their best. They're trying to create this rich, hopefully relevant, timely intelligence for law enforcement in these SARs. But the better they've done at these SARs, now it's almost like it's used against them now that they have gotten leaked. There's issues related to kind of, 314A, 314B sharing provisions. But I'm curious, do you think now that, because again, this, just so everyone knows here, this is a contextual point, we all know this, but I think I should say it, the entire anti-money laundering program and filing regime is built on this foundation that SARs are confidential. These are things that if someone normally finds out about a SAR in a court case and they try to sue for the SAR, they can't get access to it. That's where these safe harbors come into play. Do you think that banks now, two-part question, do you think that banks now are going to be a little gun shy in filing? They're going to be like, let's just do the bare minimum, please the regulators, but we can't put as much intel as we normally would in these SARs? And in the second part of this question, on the law enforcement side, could this harm active investigations? Is there any way that, again, now that this has been breached, that somehow defense attorneys or somehow can use this against any of the current investigations, or maybe current investigations that are not public, could be harmed by this?
So, okay, so first question first. The filing. The simple answer is I don't know how they're going to respond if they're going to change their approach or not. But if I were corporate counsel, which I'm not an attorney, but if I were corporate counsel to one of these financial institutions, I would say you better not stop filing, because at the end of the day, for FinCEN, we talked about the FinCEN guidance, and the upcoming changes. So FinCEN is doing everything it can to be a great partner with industry, but at the end of the day, and they're looking for comments and feedback in terms of the updated AML regulatory regime. But at the end of the day, this is not two equal parts here. These are not colleagues. One is a regulator, the other is the regulated. So if a financial institution says, hey, I'm going to be gun shy about filing as a result of this leak, good luck, because if you enable these threat networks to go through and launder funds in your bank, guess what? You're still going to be hit with massive fines, consent orders. So at the end of the day, I know this sounds harsh, but at the financial institution level, yeah, I know that your stuff, your SARs might be out there. But if a federal government employee leaked law enforcement sensitive information, and committed felonies, committed crimes against the United States, against our national security apparatus and our law enforcement apparatus, at the end of the day, as a bank, that's not your business. That's none of your business. The government has charged this person criminally. That person had their day in court. That is none of the bank's business. Their job is to continue to file, period. So the short answer is they better not. They better not change that approach, because you're going to invite a tremendous amount of scrutiny. Good luck telling your regulator later that, no, I didn't file because you had a leak before. You're going to get hit with massive fines for the things that go through your bank. So rehash me on the second question.
So now I'm wondering, well, first, I guess I'll go to the law enforcement side. There's a lot of active investigations going on. Could this hurt active investigations that are going on, because this is kind of like giving the bad guys the secret sauce
Yeah.
of, how we create bank intel on you. It's like one step before, a law enforcement looking at this and deciding if they want to do her case or not. I'm just curious what you think about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yes and no. So the no part is that, law enforcement financial investigations are forensic in nature. So they're going back and looking at time at things you've done in the past. So you can't change the past unless you have a time machine. So to that regard, that information is still there. In terms of going forward, absolutely. Because like I said before, you have these organizations that are changing their typologies, they're changing their tradecraft in terms of how they're going to launder money. So to that extent, absolutely, it's hurtful on the law enforcement side. It's also going to hurt the bank cases because, like I said before, the detection program, the models, the rules that go into these transaction monitoring systems, they should be safeguarded with their lives. I mean, those are like almost national secrets, right? I mean, like it's so important what the algorithms and how they've been tuned. If a threat organization were to get wind of exactly the details of those detection programs, they could find ways to penetrate a financial institution on a massive level.
Good point.
Just enough to evade those different thresholds. So I think that's dangerous as well.
So it's not just kind of outwitting and outfoxing the investigators to say, okay, so the bank, I alerted the bank in these 3 ways, in these different, touch points with the bank. So I'm going to make changes and adjust my money laundering in ways X, Y, and Z. That way I won't alert on the bank and law enforcement can't get me. It's the other piece of the puzzle. It's, now this is how the bank got me. This is how I can get even deeper in the bank or other banks to launder my money in a way that they'll completely miss.
Absolutely, because they're
wow.
Okay, it's excessive funds,
It's terrifying.
excessive cash deposits, structuring. I used round amount values. Whatever these, and again, the terrible detection scenarios because they're so action centric that they don't take any consideration into the actor, right? The threat organization. So most of the scenarios out there are terrible right now, and they underperform. They're very inefficient. But to that same degree, for whatever success that they have had with those detection scenarios, as it pertains to the individuals and organizations that have been named in the FinCEN files, certainly I anticipate that they will change, their processes.
So I want to end in a little bit with maybe some examples of what hybrid threat finance look like. I know we've talked about this quite a bit. You've given me great examples of like this is the transactional DNA of someone like Hezbollah. It's this country using these used cars and in this Turkey area, like things like that. Yeah, we'll let you give a good example to tease the upcoming event, but this is not happening in a vacuum. And like we talked about, FinCEN literally a week before this put out a massive advance notice of proposed rulemaking looking at, here are these changes that we want to do to better improve the anti-money laundering defenses of the United States. And it was really centered around several things: improving the efficiency and effectiveness, but guided by the very law enforcement groups that the banks are trying to serve. Now, this is a weird one because multiple people I've talked to have said there's a big gap here. How does a regulator, a federal regulator, judge law enforcement effectiveness without liaising with that law enforcement before you judge the bank? So that's kind of an issue there.
I don't understand that because they do liaise with law enforcement.
So they do. So they're going to be chatting with the law enforcement groups to kind of talk about.
They're a conduit. So they're an intermediary. They are that L&O, that liaison function between the law enforcement community and the banking world. So FinCEN, that's what a regulator is by function. Whether it's FinCEN or any other regulator, they are that intermediary. So of course, they're liaisoning between the two. But you're referring to that advance notice of proposed rulemaking, the September 17th one. And no, I find it very interesting as well.
OCC, quick question though, Josh. So you're talking about like a regulator, like an OCC would liaise with FinCEN or would liaise with kind of an investigative agency to help gauge the kind of effectiveness of the SARs filed by the bank.
Well, I mean, I would say more so FinCEN than OCC, right? I mean, but okay. You're dealing with two components of Treasury, but I mean, New York DFS, I mean, AGA looking over casinos. I mean, yeah, of course, law enforcement is the ones that have the responsibility, the federal statute responsibility of investigating these various financial crimes. So of course there's delays in some capacity. The government, is siloed at times and bureaucratic at times, but they talk to each other. They work things out amongst one another, right?
Right.
And the intent of those SARs is to develop law enforcement cases. That is the point of a SAR. So, the defensive filings we see with these institutions that get put under consent order and fined, or the, just very generic SARs. I mean, if you read that press release, that advanced notice of proposed rulemaking from FinCEN, they talked about two things that stood out to me: technology, that they really wanted to basically, modify their regulatory approach to accommodate, the updates in technology that have happened over the years, which is important, right? I mean, we have AI, we have RPA, we have machine learning, cryptocurrency, this intersection of fiat and cryptocurrency. So certainly it's something that, in order to have the capacity to regulate institutions utilizing these technologies, certainly FinCEN itself needs to understand these technologies, right? And all regulators. So that's the first thing. But the second thing, and the thing that really honed in on me, is they said, and there's been other press releases, other guidance from FinCEN and other regulators, basically saying, look, if you want to be innovative in your approach, we're going to cut you some slack. We're going to not hold you to the same standard as you do different types of innovation programs, be it technology or otherwise, if it makes you more effective at detecting financial crime. Remember, that's the whole point of this, is to detect and investigate financial crime. So they use a specific word here, the usefulness of SARs. Now, this is not new to me. I mean, if we looked at the New York Department of Financial Services Part 504 regulations from a few years back, they actually changed the definition of a SAR. It used to be suspicious or potentially suspicious transactions. I can't remember the exact verbiage, but it was something like, suspicious or potentially suspicious activities, right? Like drug trafficking, human trafficking. So, the usefulness of SARs concept is basically, how do your investigations tie in some way that a federal law enforcement agency that has specific federal statute responsibilities, like counterintelligence and foreign state actors, or terrorism, or drug trafficking, or counterfeit goods, or human trafficking, or weapons trafficking, or whatever. Like, who is the agency that's going to take this case, right? I mean, you filed the SAR, but it's just broad. And I mean, okay, maybe is it a tax evasion thing? Does it need to go to the IRS? Are there indicators that it's some other type of organization involved in some specific type of behavior? That's what I mean. That's what they mean by usefulness, is how are we going to apply this to a case? Because otherwise it's going to sit in the SAR database. So I think that makes the type of training that we're going to be doing even more impactful, because we're going to teach investigators to do just that. And again, I keep coming back to the targeting methodology here. Is right now, it's the way that you detect in the transaction monitoring space, the rules, the scenarios, and the way that investigators investigate, these things are completely intertwined. Because whatever the rule is, let's say it's a structuring rule, the investigator, I mean, at the end of the day, their first responsibility is to disposition. Did this client structure or did they not structure? Is this a false positive, or is it correct that they were engaged in some sort of structuring to evade reporting thresholds? But the second thing, if they're good investigators, they're going to go through and see, is there anything else that is not related to the initial alert? But again, you're now tying down the types of things that alert to activities that maybe are not the best use or most efficient use of those alerts to be generated from the system. It's action-centric detection logic. It's this person, this organization did a thing. We want to totally upend that construct. Not just this person, this company did a thing, but now what is the profile of our threat? And that's where we get into this hybrid threat finance notion of, we have this global threat landscape. Within this construct, we have threat classifications like drug trafficking, human trafficking, terrorism financing. And within that, we have subclassifications and organizations. We now are going to go organization by organization. We're going to parse out, how does this organization operate? What is their business model? What are their revenue generation events? How do they launder proceeds? How do they then spend their money to operationalize the continuance of their organization, their sustainment? And as we look through that, Then we're going to say, based on what we know, based on open source, information, be it federal indictments, think tanks, news, what are the typologies that they use? What are the mechanisms? What's the geography behind these
For
money?
that specific threat actor group, right?
Right. So the basis of this, the base targeting, concept behind this is really tied to behavioral psychology. And then the analytics component is how do we take elements of behavioral psychology and implement those into data, right? Both to create detection models that alert customers within the system, suspicious customers in the system, and then how do we train the end user to then understand the same thing, if that makes sense. So I'll give you an example. We'll talk like behavioral analytics. And I know you've heard other examples that I've used over the years, but so I'll give you an example. So let's say, Brian, that we have a person, okay? We'll call them subject A. And they call another person, we'll call them subject B, on the phone. Now there's two situations, okay? There's a situation where subject A calls subject B on the phone at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. That's the first situation, okay? Situation 2 is subject A calls subject B at 2 o'clock in the morning. We're gonna get into behavioral analytics here in just a moment. My question for you is, does the phone call at 2 o'clock in the morning change your view of what the relationship might be between subject A and subject B, vice a call at 2 o'clock in the afternoon?
Yeah, absolutely, because anyone can call anyone else for any reason at 2 p.m. That's completely normal.
Mm-hmm.
But at 2 a.m., I would think that it's a liaison of the romantic variety or some kind of emergency.
So I think most people would say that. So it's either a romantic relationship or an emergency. Most people don't call people at 2 o'clock in the morning. However, in an effort to put indicators together and start to build layers, I'm going to throw another layer on it, okay? So this is going to be part of our KYC, right? Now the profession of this person is a police officer. They're a first responder. Does that change your view of the 2 a.m. phone call?
Yeah, because I know, officers can have some crazy shifts. So that's a little bit, to me, that makes it a little more normal.
Right, because what if they work night shift, right? Okay, I'll throw one more, and this is part of your investigation. As you go through, you determine that this police officer is also a military veteran. They were in the service for many years. Does that change your view of what the relationship could be related to the 2 a.m. phone call?
Well, being at times when you were overseas and I get really late texts from you, I think it means exactly that. They're just working.
Right. See, but you're getting this, right? So you might be talking to your friends that are in Germany or Afghanistan or Iraq or whatever, right? And they're on different time zones, so you might be taking a late call. So I guess my point in this is, there's components of behavioral analytics here that we used in this case, the example of a phone call to illustrate a relationship. When we're doing this type of behavioral analytics, we call it pattern of life analysis. And this is the component of how we build detection models and train investigators that isn't action focused. It's really actor focused. It's actor centric targeting logic. And there's two components of it. There's the individual or the company, and basically internally how they operate and what they do and the decisions they make. And then there's the external component, which is the relationships. Everything that we do when we're looking at behavior of pattern of life, behavioral psychology, behavioral analytics, it could be the phone calls. It could also be, subject A, in the morning at 6 o'clock in the morning drives to Starbucks. And then subject A drives from Starbucks to the gym. And then subject A, drives to, their place of business. Well, how do we know that? Because the GPS, the global positioning system in their car or in their mobile phone, placed them in that place. So it denotes some sort of relationship with the coffee shop, some sort of relationship with the gym. It denotes some sort of relationship with that place of work. So all of these things like communication, physical location, travel, right? Transactions are all part of pattern of life analysis. And if you think about that, the transactional nexus, let's take a retail account, for example, you point of sale debit transactions. So what a financial institution gets back is basically you procured or sold a product or service at that place at a specific time. So the same thing, you got that geotag, right? So there's a location, there's a date, there's time, and there's a relationship. And also not just businesses, but what about transactions with counterparties that are individuals or entities? It denotes that relational concept as well. So what we really try to do is, sorry, there's a siren going by. What we really try to do is take those components of behavioral analytics that outline what people operating at a certain operational echelon within a certain line of business, within a certain threat organization, within a certain threat classification, how they launder money, and what their patterns are beyond just the simple action-based concepts. We're building a profile. And that term sometimes is profiling, sometimes is misunderstood, because it actually, there's two total different meanings to the term profiling. There's the first profiling that people hear and they go, oh, and that's your bigoted, racial profiling, things that are hateful in nature, okay? I'm talking about a totally different type of profiling. The type of profiling that articulates the behavioral attributes associated with being part of a drug cartel and part of their money laundering apparatus, being part of a violent extremist group, being involved in misappropriating funds from a government. So, this is, it's irrespective of race or religion or all those types of things. And while there could be correlations in other attributes, the profile in itself is systemically based on behavioral analytics. So we're taking that and mixing it with the traditional action-based concepts. So we're not throwing that out. The structure and the flow through of funds, the multiple beneficiary, single originator, like all of those things are important and they play together. So this is the global threat landscape. So how do we take that construct and compare it against the unique risks of that financial institution? Because just like each threat organization has their own unique DNA in terms of how they launder money, each financial institution has their own unique DNA in terms of where they're at risk of being penetrated, if that makes sense, and by whom and where.
No, that makes perfect sense. And really, this kind of, to me, it weaves into what, FinCEN is trying to do with this ANPR, is because they're trying to go from the more general to the more specific. And that's what I love about, this whole field of hybrid threat finance, is you're going from the general to the specific. It's not just a general, put this transaction monitoring alert. If it's above this amount, it alerts. And then you look at it and you have to think about it. But again, exactly what you said, when you have this mountain of alerts, it gets harder and harder to separate the wheat from the chaff and what is actually more actionable. But what you're doing here, to me, is very powerful, because you're saying, this is this specific group, this narco group, this terror group. Here is how they launder money. These 3 or 4 points, they come up again and again and again. Now think about it. If a bank, a bank is gonna find something more quickly, looking in a sea of alerts for a ton of general things that are gonna pop up all the time, or these very specific nodes that when you see them happen in unison or in a certain time period, and it goes ding here, ding in this amount, ding in this field, ding in this area, and you're like, that's the transactional DNA of this terror group.
You're getting 100%. What we're looking to do here is to professionalize and standardize financial crime investigations. We talked a lot about banks, but really this is cross-functional.
This is for anyone, really. To me, it's AML, it's an investigator.
Exactly. Let's say you're a prosecutor and you understand the law as it reads related to money laundering related offenses, but how do you construct the case, right? And this is really going to help you do that. Or you're a police detective or a federal agent or an intelligence analyst or an auditor. Or you work in insurance or what have you. There are so many different people that need this baseline. So what we're looking to do is create a common operating picture here. This is the vernacular that we use when we're conducting these types of investigations. This is the analytic process that we use, the decision-making criteria that we use. This is the way we construct different layers of information and attributes and connect those attributes. And whether you're right, your output is that you're writing a SAR, or you're developing the detection model that's going to generate the alerts in the first place, or you're defining what the risk profile of the entire financial institution, for example, you work for is, or you're working developing a federal case. You've got to understand how to construct these different components. I think that's where we're trying to go with this.
No, that's perfect. And I know we're getting close to being at time here, Josh, but is there any way you could give a little bit of a preview, an example of kind of what this might look like in terms of, here's an example of this threat group, here's the way it launders money, and here's how this could touch your bank and how this would look kind of alerting on your transaction monitoring system?
Yeah, yeah. So, there's 1,000 examples, but you mentioned Hezbollah earlier. So, it's let's kind of just construct this based on the analytic process that we use. Okay, you have this global threat landscape. Okay, and we take this organization Hezbollah, and they have crossover within different threat classification domains. Okay, so there's both an internal hybrid threat, internal to Hezbollah as an organization, and an external hybrid threat. So I'll talk about what that is. So the internal threat is that Hezbollah is a proxy of Iran, a sanctioned country that's an enemy of the United States. They are also a terrorist group. They are also a political party and military organization or military service in Lebanon and an intelligence service as well. They're also a majorly affiliated with drug trafficking in South America and with the proliferation of counterfeit goods and smuggling in South America. So these are the different threat classifications where they would fit, right, internally. But now if you take and say, let's say that, for example, hypothetically, if Hezbollah had a relationship with like FARC or a drug trafficking organization in Colombia where cocaine is proliferated, okay? And let's say that conversely, on the other side of the movement of that product, that they had relationships with Nicolas Maduro's regime in Venezuela or the Castros in Cuba. Now you have this component of this hostile state actor, right? So the hybrid threat, so to speak, here is basically threat classifications across, in this case, drug trafficking and corrupt and sanctioned states, okay, and terrorism financing, right? But as we start to go subclassifications of this, what are the money laundering themes here? Because we're looking predominantly at, my primary classification for Hezbollah would be a terrorist group. And their primary typology or scheme or TTPs, tactics, techniques, and procedures, SOPs, standard operating procedures, tradecraft, whatever you want to call it. Their primary tradecraft is they're engaged in sophisticated trade-based money laundering, okay? We look at some of the Sunni terrorist groups, and their DNA is very different. They use the Hawala system, which essentially uses informal, cash-intensive dealer brokers called hawaladars, and they will basically transcribe transaction orders on a ledger, and they'll settle them through a Sarafi exchange through money service business between the Hawala counterparties, or they'll go after misappropriating from NGOs or business or whatever. That's very much the Sunni operate in those realms. But Hezbollah, they're so associated with Iran. I mean, they're just completely like this. They're like one and the same. And Iran's been sanctioned since '79. So they're amongst the world's best money launderers and have the most sophisticated schemes. And as a result, if you look at a scheme with like Hezbollah, for example, you have the pyramid structure, okay? And at the strategic operational echelon, you're dealing with an organization where the headquarters element is going to be in Lebanon. This is your strategic decision makers, your alliances, your coordination with other state and non-state actors, right? And then you really have your operational component, which is kind of the middle ground. So it goes from strategic to operational, tactical. And your operational component is basically what are the different components of Hezbollah, like lines of business, politics, military, revenue generation, right? And then what are the geographic areas of responsibility for that organization, okay? And then as you continue to move down that pyramid, now you get to that tactical level. And now we could say within that organization, within a specific threat classification as it pertains to that organization, we are now looking at Hezbollah as they operate in South America, particularly in the tri-border area in like Paraguay and Brazil, for example. And we're looking at a typology associated with what is the revenue generation event of this component of the organization in this place and at this time, right? So the revenue generation event is going to be a combination of proceeds derived with involvement in the cocaine trade up to the United States with drug trafficking organizations, that network, that relationship that is transactional in nature, right? And that's going to be a trade-based money laundering scheme where the product is distributed, to Mexico, where the Mexican cartels take over distribution. It goes over water, it comes in through Canada, it goes in through Miami and Mobile, Alabama, through the maritime ports and
Wow.
the trade things. But still, I come back to, how do you answer the tax man or the tax woman? You have this massive revenue source. Like, how do you explain it? So the way that Hezbollah does this, obviously layered shell, shelf, and front companies. And we're going to actually talk in this series about how to determine what's a shell company. What are the investigative techniques you could do open source right now if you want to determine if something's a front company or a shell company. We're going to teach that in the trade-based money laundering course with Jimmy Arroyo from DEA. But kind of circling back, I lost my train of thought from it. Sorry. What are the underlying processes that we're going to use to basically determine, their trade-based money laundering scheme here? What are the components of it? And really, for them, their trade-based money laundering in South America is under and over invoicing of products and services.
Classic.
And they're actually double dipping on their proceeds. So they're not just making money from cocaine, but let's say that, for example, I have this watch, okay? And let's say that I sell this watch. I'm a retailer for this watch, okay? And let's say that 60% of the watches that I sell, I have a front company. It's a legitimate front company. I'm selling watches, okay? Let's say that 60% of the watches that I sell, or 70% or whatever, are real. 40% of the watches that I sell are fake. So I'm now coordinating with Chinese companies that have stolen intellectual property from American or Swiss or whatever companies and produced very realistic watches that I'm now distributing, and the margins are massive. So I'm actually double padding my pockets because I'm proceeds derived from cocaine while also earning additional proceeds by layering my legitimate product line with fakes. So what is the analytic process that you would use to detect this, both from a technology perspective and at the end user level for the investigator, be it a federal agent or a bank investigator or whatever? What is the methodology that you would use to identify this? And we're going to talk about that in the series.
Yeah, and that is a perfect thing to end on, Josh, because that's one thing that, a message that we need to get out to really the professionals in our field, financial crime compliance, and a lot of them know this already, but you need to realize, you're dealing with very, very intelligent money launderers who have a lot of experience, and they're not just coming at you in one way. It's not just they're trying to defraud your bank. It's not just they're trying to money launder through your bank. It's not just they're trying to do a cyber-enabled hack attack at your bank. They might do all three, and that's these layering of different ways. That's why you need kind of a much deeper understanding of the nuanced financial trails here to kind of parse that out and say, okay, this is indicative of this. This is weaving together with this, and I know it's indicative of this potential terror group.
Right.
So,
and that's why we created the series, Brian, because when you use that term, parse it out, we're going to get into the weeds here, and the global threat landscape, it's complicated. It's a big place, and there's a lot of moving parts. The benefit is that the global threat landscape is what it is. It's relatively static. So if you could define what that is, 2 or 3 years from now, maybe there will be a new ISIS-like terrorist group. Maybe there will be a new drug cartel to emerge in Mexico, splitting off from another drug cartel, whatever. But as it stands right here in 2020, in this moment, the global threat landscape is what the global threat landscape is. So it changes over time to some extent, but the good part is once you've parsed this out and we have a common operating picture as an industry of what it looks like, who the players are and what they're doing, we can start to not only train our end users, but we can start to get the technology component involved. And circling back to the initial discussion you and I had about artificial intelligence and machine learning, it's all about the data. It's all about the attributes. So if it's junk out, it's junk in, it's junk out. It's not just the data itself. It's what are the attributes? What are the criteria you're looking at to implement into such scenarios? So if we can think like the bad guys and understand them as a business, just like they're trying to understand the financial institutions as a business, that's the right approach.
Wow. No, I absolutely could not agree more. And like you said, the more knowledge, again, I've said this in many of these kind of discussions and on webinars, but you really need both pieces of the puzzle to be
Mhm.
successful as a financial crime compliance professional. You need the deep knowledge of these groups, not just the kind of red flags. Everyone loves to talk about red flags, but the deep knowledge of the transactional DNA of these threat actor groups. You need to have that, but you also need to have that technology so you can hopefully better tune the systems, but then get better alerts in the first place. So you have the knowledge, you have the better alerts, you're creating, again, the goal is rich, relevant, timely intelligence for law enforcement. Well, everyone, if you want to get to know Josh a little bit more, please look him up on LinkedIn. Joshua Fruth, he's an incredibly passionate professional with a deep bench of experience. So please connect with him, chat him up. And if you want to know more about this event, go to Section 2 Financial Intelligence. And again, if you want to know more about ACFCS, the Association of Certified Financial Crime Specialists, some more of our training, our certification, please go to acfcs.org. Thanks again, Josh.
Okay.